But now onto the adult side of things, and you did go into it a little bit because inevitably how we teach our students feeds into how well they know civics as adults. But maybe make it more specifically about adult education and what programs are there for them in that continuing education sphere. So, what are two or three of the biggest issues that you see facing civics education on that front for adults? And do you talk about them more in your book?
So yes, definitely. I talk about adult civic education the majority of the time in my book, and I think that so I start off with the first chapter after the introduction being called "What is Civic Education," where we trace the history of civic education. We talk about these civics requirements and what we see for high school students, and then sort of explain how that feeds into adults. I have a couple more numbers that I want to share. We have, sort of different organizations who do regular civics surveys once a year where they ask basic questions to a representative sample of American adults just to see sort of where we are. And the numbers are not good. They're basically reflecting the same thing that we see in the NAEP numbers. But the Annenberg Public Policy Center, I want to give them a shout out at the University of Pennsylvania. They
Hmm.
do the Constitution Day survey. They've done it almost every year since 2006. Um, they tend to find, numbers that are not very encouraging. So in 2023, for example, they surveyed 1,500 people. They found that only 66% could name all three branches of America's government. So that's not even three out of four. 17% of the people that they surveyed in 2023 couldn't name one of the three branches of government, which that's not a lot of people, but that I'm concerned for those folks.
Yeah.
Only 16% of people surveyed could correctly name all of the rights guaranteed in the First Amendment. About half of them, 49%, failed to name more than one freedom of speech, which we all know that one, right? Um, in 2016, so the same Constitution Day survey, it found that only 26% of Americans could name all three branches of government, which at that time in 2016 was a decline from recent years. So not only are we not getting better, but at that point we were getting worse. So that's not good at all, right? So we're looking at numbers that are not just about asking people gotcha trivia questions that maybe they weren't thinking about at the time. Maybe they left the interviewer and then later on they were like, "Oh yeah, I should have said this." Right? But it's just something that they hadn't had to think about in a while. But I think that other numbers that we get from these surveys kind of reflect a little bit more of what's going on underneath the surface. So the other thing that the Constitution Day surveys look at is they look at trust in government. And in 2023, they found that public trust in government was at only 18%. Um, that's incredibly low, right? And I can only imagine that it's gotten lower, right? Since then, with as much as everybody is just so, very angry and concerned, and all the conspiracy theories that are going on. There's also, this question about voter participation. We've had, very low levels of voter participation historically in the United States. We have seen some evidence over the past 10 to 15 years that that number for some elections, particularly presidential elections, will go up depending on, just to be blatant, whether Barack Obama or Donald Trump, if one of them are on the ballot, we see the numbers go up a little bit. But besides that, we see them being pretty low, right? And even in midterm elections, we
Yeah.
see political participation numbers being very low. And so all of this is sort of contributing to this sense that not only do people not understand how government works, but now they don't trust it and they're angry about it, right? And so all of these things kind of join together to create the situation that we have now. And I mean, you have to imagine, like, why would you trust something that you don't understand? Right? The government, to I
Fair.
think most people just seems weird and nefarious, and there's all these weird rules, and it just seems like everybody's doing what they want to do. And if you don't understand the nuances of how things work, it's very easy to believe that it's just the other side manipulating everything and that they're lying about everything, right? Because you don't really have any sort of basic understanding of what's real. So I think that's a really important part of this. Um, let's see. Another thing that I actually wanted to say too is you mentioned earlier about civics classes and what happened to civics classes. And I just want to take a few minutes to tell a quick story about that. So a lot of times when I talk to people about writing this book and talk about civic education, people always say, yeah, back in the 40s and 50s, we had these what people call Soviet style civics classes, and that was actually a good thing. And what happened to that? Why did we get rid of those? And the story of civic education in America is actually a lot more interesting than you think. I think most people just believe whichever party they are a member of, that it was the other party that messed it up somehow. And actually, it's more complicated than that. It's both parties or both members from both sides of the ideological spectrum that sort of joined together to get rid of civics. So, long story short, I'll see if I can condense this into about a few minutes. Um, Basically, when public school started in the United States, it was around the 1840s. Before then, education was only reserved for people who were very wealthy and private tutors. Those people would hire private tutors, and that's how their kids would be educated, or they would send their kids to Europe or something like that in order to get educated. And so, what we find in the 1840s is there is this sort of national impetus to try to start a public school system in America. There are some leaders in this particular movement, like Horace Mann from Massachusetts, who are the people who are pushing for this the most. But the idea is completely based on civic education, right? If you have a system that you've set up that's going to be a democracy where you're expecting for voters to actually play a role, right, in voting and voicing their opinion and how things work, then it only makes sense that you need to have some sort of basic level of education for all of those people so that they're making informed decisions. And so the decision was made to go ahead and create a public education system. Well, then fast forward about 15 or 20 years, and you get to the end of the Civil War, and all of a sudden you have this new group of citizens, right? People who are formerly enslaved, right? And so all of a sudden you have all of these new citizens, and then the question becomes, well, should these new citizens also get the benefit of learning about the civic education to sort of understand what their role is to prepare them to participate? And as you might imagine, with the history of Jim Crow segregation in the South, there were a lot of people who did not want that to happen. And so there were a lot of schools and places of education where, in particular, education about the government, education about civics was suppressed, and people were not given, up to date textbooks and things like that to try to sort of stop them from learning a lot about their status in society. So, for some people, okay, that might be the story that you expect, right? But that's not where it ends. That's only the beginning. So, if you fast forward another 50 to 75 years, you get to the Cold War. And all of a sudden, those same people who are trying to stop certain communities from learning about civics, learning about the history of America and government, well, they now want them to learn about it as quickly as possible, right? They want them to learn as much as they can about America to instill patriotism and to make sure that they're not going to be susceptible to communist influences. And so all of a sudden, the same people who are trying to stop these communities from learning about civics are now trying to put more civic instruction into classrooms in low income areas and inner city areas and in areas that are predominantly populated by people of color. And so what we find is that all of a sudden, members on the left who are leaders of these groups of communities of color, of low income people, of workers, and things like that, well, they become very suspicious of the fact that the government is trying to teach their students about history and about politics. And they start thinking about this in terms of being some sort of brainwashing scheme, some sort of government plot to whitewash American history and to teach their kids this sort of version that's been dumbed down or distilled or that makes the founding fathers seem infallible or something along those lines. And so all of a sudden, you get these leaders on the left who are railing against civic education, calling it something that's an attack on their children, saying that their children are being brainwashed, which sounds a lot like what we've seen in America over the last few years coming from conservatives who are worried about education, saying that their children are being brainwashed. So this is not the first time that we've seen that happen in American history. And so, long story short, basically, those liberal leaders joined together with leaders on the right who, at this point, are concerned about America falling behind in the space race and want to start redirecting education money towards science and math and other STEM topics. Right. All of a sudden, we get these strange bedfellows where we have liberal leaders who are worried about whitewashing, and we have conservative leaders who are worried about science and technology. And they come together to basically reallocate education funding across the country towards different avenues, right? Whether it be STEM or whether it be, studies in liberal arts that are studies of certain regions and ethnicities and cultures and things like that. And lo and behold, civic education across the country is defunded. And so My point with saying all of that, sorry for taking up so much time there, but I think it's important for people to understand that history because it's not one group or another, it's not one ideology or another that has gotten us to the situation where we are now. This is Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, independents, right? All of these people sort of joining together at some point and playing a role in basically killing civic education in America, or at least strangling it, right? And so now, because all of these people have worked together to destroy it, all of these people are going to have to work together to fix it, to rebuild it, right? There's no scenario in which one group in American society is going to be able to fix this problem. Everybody is going to have to come together and work together to fix this problem.
That's a really fascinating history. That's a lot of that stuff I did not know about, but I mean, it it goes to show you just how long we've had this issue with civic education, and it's easy for one side or the other to say, "Well, see, yeah, they ruined it because conveniently they're on the other side of the aisle," kind of like you said. There's something else I was going to say.